Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll just give everyone a minute to join us. Salam, welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, bonjour, buenos dias. Thank you for being with us here today. My name is Maaza Siyum, and I am the Global South Convener for the People's Vaccine Alliance. I will be moderating this press conference on behalf of the People's Vaccine Alliance. The PVA is a global coalition of over 100 organizations and networks supported by Nobel laureates, health experts, economists, heads of state, faith leaders, and activists working together to ensure that vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics are available free of charge to everyone everywhere. We are here today in the lead up to the World Trade Organization's 12th Ministerial Conference, which is scheduled to take place June 12th to 15th in Geneva. We have 4 amazing speakers who will be with us today. Before I introduce them, I just want to run through a little bit of housekeeping for everybody. All microphones are turned off at the moment, except for the panelists who have the ability to mute or unmute themselves. So if you would like to ask a question of the panelists at that point, please either raise your hand. There is a raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, at which point we will unmute you, or type your question into the Q&A box that you see below. Whether you put your questions in the Q&A box or say them aloud to the panelists, please say your name, which outlet you are from, and who your question is addressed to. Just to note for everyone that if you would like to ask a question anonymously, there is an option in the Q&A box to do that. But even if you do ask a question anonymously, please let us know who your question is directed to so we can ask it accordingly. We might not get to all of the questions, but we will do our best. We expect to be here for about 45 minutes or an hour, wrapping up at 5 p.m. in South Africa at the latest. We are recording this press conference, and we will make the recording available to all of the participants. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you. Before I introduce the speakers, I'm just going to provide a little bit of background, a brief reminder of why we are here for this press conference today. 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, and after 20 million lives lost, it is shameful that the World Trade Organization's intellectual property barriers remain an obstacle to global production of and access to COVID-19 vaccines, medicines, and tests. A legal text led by South Africa and India to waive certain provisions for the WTO's agreement on trade-related intellectual property was submitted in October 2020 and has 65 country co-sponsors. In the period since this submission was made, millions of people have died as a result of COVID-19, and countless others have continued to suffer the devastating effects of the pandemic. Despite the efforts of many, 3 WTO members, the European Union, Switzerland, and the UK have blocked the rest of the world. The process developed by the WTO to unjam this process brought together the EU, South Africa, India, and the US at the start of 2022. That process ended with a text that would not remove the IP barriers, limiting global production and access, and indeed could add some new constraints to existing WTO flexibilities. This text has been rejected worldwide. As I said earlier, we are here in the build-up to MC12, which is scheduled to take place in about 2 weeks. We are honored to have 4 amazing people with us today, all of whom are passionate about health and human rights and have worked extensively on COVID-19 and are determined to make sure that we actually learn from this pandemic and prepare for the next pandemic. They will comment on negotiations over a text that would govern how countries can exercise flexibilities under existing WTO rules. They will outline a path by which WTO member states can salvage these negotiations and set a precedent that can help facilitate equitable access to tools to beat pandemics. I'll introduce all of the panelists now and then ask each of them to make an opening statement. After they have made their opening statements, we will open it up to questions from the journalists. So here are the people we have with us today. Winnie Byanyima, UN Undersecretary General, Executive Director of UNAIDS, and co-chair of the People's Vaccine Alliance. Winnie is currently in Canada on a UNAIDS trip. So Winnie, we're very grateful to you for making time to be with us here today for this press conference. We also have Joseph Stiglitz, a professor at Columbia University and the president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. In addition to being a Nobel Prize winning economist, he has written extensively about the COVID-19 pandemic and how much the current situation has led to furthering global inequity. He's also joining us from the road. He's currently in Europe. Welcome, Professor Stiglitz. I hope it's okay if I call you Joe. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Also with us is Fatima Hassan, founder and director of the Health Justice Initiative. Fatima is a human rights lawyer and has been making lots of good trouble on access to medicines and other important tools for close to 2 decades. She's joining us from Cape Town, South Africa. Welcome, Fatima. And finally, we're thrilled to have with us George Poe Williams. He's Secretary General of the National Health Workers Union of Liberia and a frontline nurse in Liberia. We all cheered, George, when we saw you last week in Davos, protesting pharma CEOs for their record profits. You are continuing your advocacy this week and joining us from Geneva. Welcome, George, and thank you for including this stop in your busy schedule this week. We really appreciate it. Thank you. So now we will start with opening statements from each of the 4 panelists. Each of you will have 5 minutes, and after we go through those opening statements, we will open it up to questions from the journalists. So Joe, I'll start with you. Please go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me begin with the statement that many of you know. The WTO seems stuck in dealing with the problem of a vaccine waiver, the IPR waiver that would allow an increase in the production of not only vaccines, but other COVID-19 products. Let me spend a minute talking about how we got in this position, going back to almost 30 years to the founding of the WTO. The agreement within the WTO called TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property, it's not actually trade-related, it's all intellectual property, was foisted on the world by a narrow set of special interests, with the pharmaceutical industry and the entertainment industry being among the most important. It was not a reflection of what would be good for research, innovation. They didn't ask the academics. I was at the time on the Council of Economic Advisors, very much in touch with researchers, and many of us were very skeptical of those intellectual property provision. They were not well balanced. But even then, they incorporated what they are called in WTO language flexibilities. These were ideas that in the event of an epidemic, a pandemic, countries could issue a compulsory license, which gave the right to produce, but paying royalties, reasonable royalties. So it wasn't seizing their properties, but it was saying you can't make 1,000% returns off the lives of people who are at risk. The original provisions proved inadequate, and that was shown in the HIV AIDS epidemic at the end of the last century. And response to that was to try to clarify it, make sure that in the event of another epidemic, there was quicker response. But let me make clear that there was a conflict here. The drug companies did not want a quick response. The slower the response, the higher their profits. More people died, but that's not their concern. Their concern was profits over people's lives. And so when the current pandemic occurred, the provisions that had originally been put in to enable society to be protected didn't work with the urgency that was needed for this terrible disease. And the result is millions having died, and many of them would not have died had there been an increased supply, and there would have been an increasing supply had the intellectual property rights not have been waived in the way that South Africa and India proposed at the very beginning of the pandemic. So the principle was clear from the very beginning of WTO. Let me make that clear. The principle was agreed on. And it's the pharmaceutical industry that has been trying to undermine that by a variety of forms of foot dragging. What they have done, in effect, is to increase the transaction costs that make it very slow, very difficult. And that was why there was such a clamor for a waiver, a simple waiver. Let me make it clear, intellectual property is a social construction. It's something that we as a society have designed, which is intended to provide incentives, but to balance those incentives for research with access to knowledge. And unfortunately, we didn't get that balance right, as we've seen in this pandemic. The current framework is a failure. Now, the current proposal that is being discussed, sometimes described as the rump text, it was an agreement between US, Europe, South Africa, and India, except it was a peculiar agreement in which 3 of those 4 said they didn't agree. So it wasn't an agreement. And the current text is that which is similar to that which is advocated by Europe, reflecting the interest of the pharmaceutical industry. What they are proposing is a trade-off. We'll allow a few greater flexibilities, more access to COVID-19 vaccines now, in return, and saving lives now, in return for more stringent conditions going forward. Now, let me make it clear that there's a great deal of debate, as there always is, about the meaning of particular words in the text. But that is the point. What is certain is that there is uncertainty in this text. And the point of the waiver is to say, let's get rid of the legal uncertainty, because the legal uncertainty is itself a barrier. What company wants to enter and start producing if it's going to be sued? And so what we want is that legal certainty. There's a very easy way of getting that legal certainty: a clean vaccine waiver along the lines that was proposed originally.
Joe,
okay, let me stop there and let me just say one more thing. The consequences of this, not only for the lives of so many people and the health of so many people, are clear, but the fact that the advanced countries, in Europe in particular, are not willing to put the lives into account of millions of people all over the world has undermined support for globalization and is leading to a more divided world with untold consequences going forward.
Thank you very much, Joe. Winnie, I'll hand over to you now for your opening statement, please, for about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Maza, and I'm delighted to be on the panel with my friend Joe, with George and Fatima. Heading into the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference, it is indeed disappointing that WTO members have still not reached an agreement on a TRIPS waiver for COVID technologies. As Joe has said, South Africa and India proposed a waiver, simple waiver of intellectual property for COVID-19, not only vaccines, but tests and treatments 20 months ago. 100 countries backed the call. This should have been simple and straightforward. It is frankly the minimum we should expect in the middle of a pandemic when people are dying, to ensure that governments can take steps to protect public health without WTO rules coming in the way. And it should have happened long ago. It would have allowed qualified manufacturers in developing countries, and we know they are there, to produce these life-saving vaccines, helping secure the supply that was needed for people in those countries. Instead, negotiation has been derailed by a number of rich countries. They chose instead to protect the monopolies and profits of pharma companies, and millions of people have died who shouldn't have died. 75% of people in high-income countries are fully vaccinated today. Under 13% of people in low-income countries are vaccinated. 20 million lives lost. Now, WTO members are considering whether we need a real TRIPS waiver or perhaps something less than that. There is a debate over which countries are eligible. I have to ask, is the biggest problem we face really that too many countries might work together to ensure affordable access to vaccines, medicines, and treatments? No, it's not. So this system is broken. In a pandemic, sharing technology is life or death, and we are choosing death. Whether this is about an AIDS pandemic, as I work on, and the need to share long-acting antiretroviral technologies, or this continuing COVID-19 pandemic, even some have declared a victory, but it's not there yet, or the next pandemic, which will come, whether we like it or not. So what is needed today is a clear, unambiguous TRIPS waiver. This means no new barriers or hurdles. No government should have to weigh the WTO obligations against saving lives and stopping the pandemic. Rich countries have an opportunity to do the right thing in the coming few weeks. I implore them to put people ahead of profits. Hoarding the rights and recipes to life-saving, pandemic-ending medicines means letting people die, letting pandemics drag on, endangering everyone, and undermining the global economy. As Joe has said, this is going to create more and more distrust in globalization and will divide our world more. If we share technology, the big companies, pharma, will still be rich, only slightly less, and everyone in the world will be safer and better off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winnie. Fatima, I'll hand over to you now for about 5 minutes.
Thank you, and just such an honor to be on this panel, which I think is quite unprecedented, and I think tells you what's at stake. We have a Nobel laureate economist, the head of UNAIDS, and a frontline nurse who last week was harassed by the police in Switzerland for protesting, the obscene profits of CEO billionaires. And it tells you that there is a global movement of groups and researchers and activists and former world leaders. It's not just a small group of medicine activists who are saying that we can't continue in this way. It is untenable. TRIPS is actually not fit for purpose and has let us down in this pandemic. And there are 5 reasons why I think TRIPS has let us down, and why many of us are saying the WTO is no longer fit for purpose, particularly in the build-up to this ministerial conference. The first is there's been a shameful delay in the middle of a pandemic. For 18 months, the negotiations were stalled, and now all of a sudden they are being steamrolled. And they are being steamrolled in a way to protect the reputation of the World Trade Organization and the leadership of the DG of the WTO, instead of saving lives and instead of sharing technology. And instead, there is a continued emphasis, even as far back as last Friday, by the UK and Swiss governments to try and actually continue hoarding knowledge and to try and limit the scope of a very limited tax, which is now being proposed by the DG of the WTO, as Joe has indicated quite early on. And so in our view, it's a very undemocratic process. I mean, Winnie has mentioned 100 countries, 65 co-sponsors for 18 months, and we've had no substantial progress. And what we have actually is one of the most obscene things in this pandemic, that for 18 months, we were told the waiver would not make a significant difference to manufacturing capacity of production or sharing of knowledge. But 18 months later, with gross vaccine apartheid, gross vaccine injustice, we have a situation where a handful of countries are trying to limit the waiver to only vaccines. So a waiver that was not supposed to make significant difference to anybody's lives, according to these governments and according to these pharmaceutical companies, has been resisted, has been blocked. There are vested interests trying to oppose it. So one, has to ask the question that if the waiver was not going to make a significant difference, why has there been so much resistance to it? I think the second injustice is that we are still now, in June 2022, 15 million deaths later, only talking about vaccines, when treatments, diagnostics, ventilators are equally important, the COVID-19 technologies that Winnie has mentioned. And we don't trust the WTO, we don't trust the countries that are trying to block it and limit its scope, that in 3 and 6 months' time, they will try and get resolution on the issue of treatment and diagnostics. Because for 18 months, they haven't even been able to achieve a proper waiver or a solution on the issue of vaccines. And the WTO, we know our colleagues at Third World Network have been saying to us for years, are notorious for missing deadlines. And I think this is the reason why we are only still discussing what's possible for a vaccine waiver in June of 2022. So we, of course, as civil society have said, and we've said this publicly, we disapprove of the DG's tax. It is a tax that is trying to be basically be rammed through an undemocratic process, where we are being given arbitrary deadlines to try and get some kind of consensus and agreement that will actually not really meaningfully help anybody. And we can go through the reasons for that. It is not a credible tax. It should not be agreed upon by countries in the global south. We have told our own governments, particularly the governments of South Africa and India, to not sign on to this tax. It will actually be a worse deal. It will tie our hands for future purposes, and it will actually not give us the space and the freedom to operate in the way that we need. And the UK and Swiss, I'd just like to, take a minute to spend some time on that. And, the irony of the Partygate government of Boris Johnson is that it has now proposed new language further to the already watered down version of the DG's tax. This was just a few days ago, which seems to really, in our view, smack of an attempt to further delay any kind of consensus or any kind of agreement, even on the narrow aspect of a vaccine waiver. And that deals with further attempts to try and limit this narrow waiver, introducing even more TRIPS plus provisions and languages, trying to limit the very narrow flexibilities that were initially kind of proposed in the DG's tax, and trying to limit the scope of the decision. So, just to wrap up, what we are saying to our governments in the global south is that you've led quite bravely for 18 months in proposing this waiver. You now need to step up and propose textual amendments. If the UK and Swiss can propose new language, then so too can countries in the global south. We need textual amendments, and we need to ensure security of supply, not just of vaccines, but of therapeutics, of diagnostics, of other medical technologies as well, to avoid the situation that we are currently facing, which is one of hoarding and which is one of vaccine and treatment apartheid. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. George, we'll hand over to you now for about 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you so kindly. And I come to this press conference with heavy heart because over the years what we have experienced and how much we have spoken, and to the extent that up to this day, there is no change in the global system, I'm disappointed. Even after so many persons have died, I wondered how many more should die before a few handful of people will listen and serve humanity. So I just want to tell the story as we have gone through at the bedside. So maybe somebody out there who cares can listen, and perhaps it touches their heart and be able to listen to the cries of over 100 countries calling for trade waiver. As a frontline nurse in Liberia, I experienced the brutal impacts of the broken global pharmaceutical system firsthand when Ebola decimated my country. Close to 1 in 10 of my health workers' colleagues died. We call for governments to fund the search for an effective vaccine for public goods. Unfortunately, our calls went unanswered. And when things are left to the market, our lives in the global south just aren't profitable enough to save. The sad truth is that big pharma firms have spent far more on erectile dysfunction products than they have ever spent on Ebola medicines. We need to reshape the global pharmaceutical system so that life-saving medicine and supplies are finally treated as global public goods and accessible to all who need them. When you bring this experience we had over to COVID epidemic, unfortunately, the lessons from our experience of Ebola were not learned. When COVID hit, pharmaceutical corporations saw a chance to use massive public funding to pump their earnings at our expense. While they made record profits, we had workers pay the price for years of austerity and understaffing of our health systems. Many of us had to work double or triple shift in brutal conditions without adequate protection for ourselves. Pharma corporations have been promoting their donation model as this allowed them to continue selling at a profit while maintaining their monopolies. But this model has clearly failed. While many people in wealthy countries are getting their third or fourth boosters, 2 billion people haven't been offered their first. Why? Because they are more profitable. Fewer than a third of my people in Liberia have been vaccinated. The donation model also means that we health workers are receiving vaccines left over from other countries, which are often very close to their expiring date, making it harder to get them out into our communities in time. Pharmaceutical companies are also claiming that the problem is hesitancy, but this just isn't the key issue. In Africa, for example, as a continent, actually administer more than 65 to 70% of doses they have received, as compared to the rich nations that have administered only around 70%. Finally, pharmaceutical corporations have been promoting the patronizing myth that the vaccine is too complicated for us in the global south to manage. Not only is this insulting, it is also a patent lie. An investigation by the New York Times journalists found at least 10 companies across the global south who are able to produce vaccines if patents were waived. And that was why I decided to go to Davos, uninvited, of course, to confront the real winners of the pandemic, who are pharma CEOs and billionaires. I thought that the best way to protest their massive profits would be to sarcastically clap for them, the way that people across the world clap for us health workers while we were dying in the pandemic. While I was clapping, Pfizer CEO Inside announced they would start selling some of their products to some developing countries at cost. This might sound like a good thing, but this is not solidarity. It isn't charity. As the old saying goes, farmers agreeing to sell some countries their fish at cost while maintaining the monopoly ownership over the fishing rod. Meanwhile, billions across the world will still lack access to vital vaccines and medicines, leading to millions of avoidable deaths. It will not address the fact that patents have been holding back the production of life-saving medicines, which we frontline health workers need. These medicines and supplies must finally be treated as global public goods, non-privatized monopolies. Let's not clap for the broken solution of pharma CEOs. Let's push our leaders to finally put our lives ahead of their profits. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, George. And thank you, everyone. Just a reminder to the panelists who joined after we started, at the moment, all microphones are turned off except for the panelists who can mute or unmute themselves. If you have a question for the panelists, please feel free to either raise your hand, at which point one of the hosts will unmute you, or you can type your questions in the Q&A box. I already have a couple of questions that have come up. When you ask your questions, please provide your name and the outlet that you are here from, as well as who from our four panelists, Fatima Hassan, Winnie Byanyima, Joseph Stiglitz, and George Williams, who of the panelists you are addressing your question to. That would be very helpful. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, that option is available in the Q&A, but still please do say who your question is addressed to. So I have a question here from AFP to you, Joe, and to Winnie. Do you believe an agreement is possible on the TRIPS waiver before or during the ministerial? And if that would even be desirable if the deal resembles the text presented by the Secretariat? What would not securing a deal mean for WTO and Dr. Ngozi, who has made this a priority? So that's both to you, Joe, and to Winnie. Please, whoever would like to take that first. You're on mute, Joe.
I will let Joe go first.
Okay. Well, I think, like most people, that a bad deal is worse. No deal is better than a bad deal. And as I said, there are two key problems. One of them is that there is going back on what was previously incorporated in, say, the HIV, at the time of the HIV AIDS epidemic, and Winnie could speak probably more to that. They say that's not the case. What is clear, if you read all the disputes about it, is that there's ambiguity. And ambiguity in itself is a barrier. And that's why I emphasized in my talk that we need a clean waiver that doesn't try to sort out lots of other problems that exist. Just have the waiver. The second point I want to emphasize has to do with the fact that most of the attention is on vaccines. The United States and a lot of other countries are going beyond vaccine to testing and treatment, partly because there's such vaccine resistance. But what is very clear is that if we are going to stop this disease from festering, we have to be comprehensive in our approach. And this is not comprehensive. And finally, part of what is at issue here is how well prepared will we be for the next pandemic, and there will be another pandemic. And to the extent that this is a step backward, and there seems clear evidence that at least some of the provisions are a step backwards, this makes us less prepared for the next pandemic. We really ought to be working with that in mind And unless the WTO can make clear that it is well prepared for the next pandemic, obviously there's going to be an undermining of confidence.
Thank you, Joe. Anything to add, Winnie?
Yes, I fully agree with Joe and want to add this, that this is about COVID today. But as I said, it's about it's about access to medicines globally. It's about other vaccines, it's about other treatments, it's other tests, about access to health technologies. And what's needed is a simple waiver, not more complications, not making an exception for COVID, but really setting a precedent for the future. And what is at stake is more than just this situation of COVID. It's, as we said earlier, a blow to World Trade Organizations and a rule-based just system of trade. It's against that. Faith in it will weaken even further. That's one. And globalization generally, that people will more and more see that they are losers and that the winners are a handful of rich people in rich countries. And this loss of faith in globalization will have consequences, continued consequences. They are already there, we can see, but it will be difficult for us to live on this planet in a way of collaborating, of solidarity, of give and take to each other. If a few rich countries can hold out at the cost of lives in poorer countries, this is not a way to go into the future. But my last point here is that many, apart from the economic inequality there are other inequalities that are driving this. And people are asking questions. If the people who are not accessing COVID vaccines were also people of the same race as those who control the technologies today, would this happen? Would this happen? So many inequalities are showing their ugly face, and people are saying we are in a divided world where some people's lives matter and others don't. This for me is dangerous because we created the United Nations to try to build one world where all lives are valued. Humanity is one. So this is undermining the very universal norms that are in the instruments that all countries have signed. So let us not kid ourselves. And lastly, this is not about the leadership of Ngozi.
Can I add one more point?
She's worked hard to bring governments to the table to do the right thing. This is about governments failing. This is not about Ngozi failing. So I salute her for her efforts. She's done everything she could, but this is in the hands of our leaders, our governments. Yes, Joe.
I wanted to just add one more point to re-emphasize what Winnie said about global solidarity. I was at Davos last week, and one of the things that was very disheartening to many people, but not surprising to me, was that support for Europe and the United States action against Russia's invasion of Ukraine for many countries was undermined by their sense of inequity related to what has been happening to the to this TRIPS waiver.
Mm-hmm. True. Thank you. Thank you both. Fatima, I have a set of questions for you, which we have put together from Agnes Pedrero and Dan Okoth, who ask similar questions. What exactly does the EU text entail? What specifically makes you say that this is not a simple waiver, and how would it be detrimental to the original proposal? And Agnes is from AFP. Please go ahead, Fatima.
Thanks. So my colleagues at Third World Network and Methods on Frontiers have done...
Fatima, you're a bit faint. We've lost your sound a little bit. You've become faint.
Is that better?
It's a little bit better. Yep.
Okay. So my colleagues at Third World Network and Methods on Frontiers have done a detailed analysis of the DG's text of the EU recent proposals, which constitute what we call leaked text. And then the most recent language that we believe has come from the UK and Switzerland in a further set of leaked text. So one of the difficulties of dealing with this very non-transparent and, in my view, undemocratic process is that we have to rely on leaked text and leaks in particular from Politico or from media houses to understand what is actually going on. But despite those challenges, Third World Network and MSF are doing a daily update of the paragraph by paragraph analysis of where the weaknesses are in limitations. And they can be broken down into a few broad categories. One of the issues is the pushback around the scope. And by that, we mean that there's only discussions on vaccines and not treatment and diagnostics and the other technologies. And so the scope is a very critical aspect because the original waiver proposal was even for ventilators, was for all COVID-19 technologies. So in 2022, to be not having the conversation right now urgently on diagnostics and treatment is really just, doesn't make any sense. There are other aspects to what the EU and other countries are proposing, who have disproportionate amount of power in the WTO and in these kind of negotiations. And that is the push to try and use compulsory licensing as the solution in this pandemic, the desire that certain countries must opt out of using the waiver, which would mean that countries that can actually make vaccines and treatments and diagnostics would not be eligible to actually make that and then import to countries that really need it. So eligibility and the opt-out clauses, particularly the push by the US to insist that China be excluded from this particular waiver is obviously, linked to broader geopolitical issues, but it's going to have an impact around who can actually manufacture and who can send those products urgently. And then there's, language around anti-diversion measures, really excessive language, even stuff that doesn't currently exist in TRIPS around notification, around necessity standards, around the exclusion of trade secrets and just, singular focus on patents when remember the original proposal was IP is made up of many different elements. It's not just patents and obviously we're not just talking about vaccines. So there's various elements that is going to make it even more difficult, which is why we've said to governments in the global south, and yes, they need to step up, and yes, they need to propose textual amendments, but remember, there is always a threat of trade pressure and trade sanctions. That doesn't mean that as civil society, we won't hold them to account as well. And, just lastly, I want to say that as civil society, we disagree. We disagree with the view that it's only governments who actually need to push, and it's only the global south. I think it behooves the democratic, if the WTO wants to be a democratic tradition, to actually listen to the 100 countries that have supported the waiver. And we do believe there's been a steamrolling process, and we do believe that the Secretariat of the WTO is trying to get a deal before the ministerial conference to try and make itself relevant. And this has to be pushed back because we're going to get a deal that is going to be so bad that it's going to tie our hands. People at HealthGap and many other organizations have done the analysis of what this means for the mRNA hub in South Africa. And we can talk about that later. But there are really dangerous conversations, dangerous in the sense of dangerous for access and for equity that are happening right now that has to be resisted. And this is why we've said to the South African government and the Indian government and every single government in the global south, stand up and propose textual amendments. If they are shot down, let us show the world who are shooting those textual amendments down. Let us show the world which countries have vested interests that Joe has talked about that don't want to actually have a proper, not geographically limited, not conditional, not restrictive waiver. Thanks.
Thank you, Fatima. So we'd now like to go to somebody who has their hand raised. I see Doug Palmer from Politico has his hand raised. Doug, I hope your microphone is on. Please go ahead and let us know who your question is directed to.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Oh, we've lost you now, Doug. I could hear you for a second, but now you've gone quiet. Please start again. You're muted. Try again, Doug. I see you should be able to go now. Yep, I can hear you. Go ahead, Doug. Doug, we're struggling to hear you. Maybe we will sort that out. And here, try one more time, Doug. I see your mic is on now. Go ahead. Okay, Doug, we seem to be struggling to get you. We'll try again. In the meantime, I have a question here from The Guardian, from Phil Inman, who asks, could the speaker say why they think the official delegations from South Africa and India have failed so far to call out foot dragging by the European Union, UK, etc., since they joined the Quad? And should South Africa and India pull out of the Quad to better represent their demands for an IP waiver for vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics? That's a question from Phil Inman at The Guardian. So I'm not sure that it's not directed to anyone in particular. Fatima, maybe you could start, and then the others could say, since you do sit in South Africa at the moment, so why do you think the official delegations from South Africa and India have failed so far to call out the foot dragging by the European Union, UK, etc., since they joined the Quad? And should South Africa and India simply pull out of the Quad to better represent their demands for an IP waiver for vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics? And I see Winnie's hand is up. So Winnie, if you'd like to maybe start there, since we haven't heard you in a minute, and then we can go to Fatima.
No, let Fatima go first.
Okay, go ahead, Fatima.
Thanks, Winnie. Thanks, Maza. So I think you have to ask the South African and Indian governments that question directly. Because I can't speculate. Obviously, for us, it's unacceptable. But our president has called out the delays, and our president has repeatedly at every global forum, even as recently as a few weeks ago, said that a true, genuine IP waiver has to include vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics. And that is why what we've had in the last few weeks, when the so-called tax came out purporting to be the Quad tax, which then, as you know, was then tabled as the DG tax under DG responsibility, our government didn't indicate that this is not the tax that they've agreed to. And it is still being debated based on, approaches that many of us have made to the South African government to say to them that they shouldn't accept this deal. So I think it's a bit more complicated than what is currently being portrayed on the surface of things in terms of the minimal amount of media reports. It doesn't help when our government also is not sharing information on a daily basis. Often we find journalists saying to us that they're struggling to even get answers from the relevant department who's actually in charge of the negotiation. The only thing I can share with you is that our president has been firm from day one that the waiver must include all three elements at minimum, and that it would be difficult for South Africa to only sign on to a waiver that only deals with patents for vaccines. That is why the demands of civil society in South Africa and the rest of the world on the Indian and South African governments have been, we have supported you for 2 years on this waiver of October 2020. Don't sign a bad deal, don't tie your hands behind your back. But more importantly, right now, when the world is looking at you, propose the necessary textual amendments so that there can be a true, genuine negotiation of what is really missing in the current leaked text of, as recent as 48 hours ago. So some of us are also commenting on different versions of the text. So, I'd just like to put that disclaimer there as well. Thanks.
Okay. I just want to say that we regret very much the delays. But we salute very much the leadership of South Africa and India in this whole process. Staying focused, insisting on the issues, and getting up to here, building a whole coalition of countries behind this. We salute them. Now, I know many civil society groups that in trade negotiations have always said, no deal is better than a bad deal. I think that is okay, but we have to look at the details that are there. I trust the government of South Africa to take a hard look and see whether the final text is going to has something that is a win that the world can go forward with as we fight harder and harder for a rule system that doesn't put profits before people. But I trust the government of South Africa and India to make the call at the last moment. These negotiations are now in a stage where there is a lot of secrecy around them. It's understandable. It's about give and take, and we will know at some point. We will stay close with these governments we've supported, India, South Africa, and we will continue giving them what we are hearing and good ideas from everybody. But ultimately, I trust them to act in the interests of the people in the South, because that is how they have behaved up to this point.
Thank you, Winnie. I see George has his hand raised. Please go ahead, George.
I just wanted to add that this call to hold on to the original text and to make sure that lives are put before profit is not only to South Africa and India, it is to each and every one of the over 100 countries that have signed up behind South Africa and India to stand up even stronger than ever before. This is about human lives. We can no longer hide behind innovation when the whole world is calling for just a basic waiver of trade. And people think they can hold patent and continue to make profit while millions of people died across the world. So it's about time that our leaders hold together on this one issue and make sure that they can give the people of the world something to live for. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Joe, I see your hand is up, but I want to take advantage of the question from Doug. Doug, I'm sorry we couldn't get your mic to work, but I see that you've sent your question in the chat. And Joe, maybe you could chime in on both, because the question is partially addressed to you. If you could assess the Biden administration's performance on the issue. 1 year ago, the US raised a lot of hope that the deal could be made. In retrospect, do you believe the US was ever serious about reaching a deal along the lines of what you think was needed? And Fatima, Winnie, George, if you have anything to add about that. But and Joe, I know that you had something else that you wanted to say, so please go ahead.
Yeah, well, that question fits in with what I was going to say. There are power relationships both within and between countries. And I've seen in other contexts, countries are often nervous to stand up to the powerful advanced countries. So, there are many instruments that the advanced countries have of keeping other countries in line. So this is only, so I think you have to see and worry about the response of South Africa and India. If this were a standalone issue, I know they would stand up for their people. But the question is, what other threats, subtle or non-subtle, have been exercised? Within the United States, there are power relationships. If you were to ask what most Americans believe, I think most Americans would support a comprehensive waiver. I don't think we are selfish as a people. It is a question of the power of the vested interest, the pharma, within the United States. Now, what makes it very peculiar, you might say, in this case, is the American people and people in other advanced countries have paid for the overwhelming majority of the expenses of developing these products, including the vaccines. That's why it's sometimes referred to as the people's vaccine. It was our money that went into it. Basic research developed the mRNA platform. Operation Warp quickly developed the help to support bringing the vaccine to market. In that sense, we paid for it, but we are not getting the return. And the fact that we are not acting with the urgency that is required has resulted in the disease festering, leading to mutations that put all of us at greater risk, or mutations that can be more dangerous or contagious or even vaccine resistant. Now, I was very pleased when the Biden administration responded. It was not as strong a response as I would have hoped. They focused on vaccines, not on the broader, more comprehensive IPR waiver, intellectual property waiver, that I would have advocated. And the irony is particularly great because the United States is moving on to testing and treating. And while the United States is talking internally about testing and treating and treatment, we are not dealing with the intellectual property associated with testing and treatment. So in that sense, you might say the glass is maybe a quarter full and 3/4 empty, that the administration supported something was an achievement, because the drug companies were using all their political clout to make sure to try to persuade them that nothing would happen. And there are many people in Congress, particularly the Republican Party, that are in the pocket of the drug companies. But we haven't done enough. I think if we had used our clout more, I think there would have been more progress on a clean waiver.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. I see that Sarah has her hand up. Can we get Sarah, please? Sarah, please go ahead and introduce yourself. Let us know which outlet. I think you're from Politico, Sarah, and I think your question will probably be our last one, but please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Sarah Ann Arup from Politico Europe. My question is about the waiver opponents' argument that the problem right now isn't supply, but rather vaccine hesitancy and distribution issues. Do you agree that supply itself isn't the issue right now? And what's your answer to this? Thanks.
George, I see Winnie is getting ready, and George, I know you had mentioned hesitancy in your intro, so whoever of you wants to take that question, please, for Sarah from Politico Europe.
Yes, this one drives me crazy, makes me angry. And I'm speaking now as an African woman, not even as a UN official, because it's like the victim being blamed. People are waiting for months for supplies of vaccines. Governments could not launch vaccination campaigns for most of 2021 because there was no sustainable supply. Vaccine came in an erratic way. Countries didn't know which vaccine is coming, which type, when, how many doses. Therefore, they couldn't plan properly for vaccinations. People lost trust in that wait. We know this, it's evidence. There's evidence. We collect the data on a pandemic, HIV. We know that hesitancy grows when you delay, when you cannot deliver. So again, the countries that have been most denied vaccines, the low-income countries, mostly in Africa, also are the ones who know a lot about vaccination and where the people believe in vaccination, for heaven's sake. these are the countries with many infectious diseases and where vaccinations are happening all the time, and there are systems and ways of delivering vaccines to people, and communities have been fighting HIV and know about prevention campaigns, about treatment campaigns. The social and physical infrastructure is fairly strong there. So vaccine hesitancy was just an excuse by companies and governments who were hoarding vaccines and were ashamed and tried to find excuses. But yes, there are issues of logistics. There is a financial gap there. These are very weak health systems that were already getting less and less out of budgets as governments struggled to repay debt. That's true. There was a financing gap there. G20 countries went to their meeting and came up with a solution that left them mostly in the same place, still having to repay debt as they watched their people die. Again, that was a failure of the international system, failing to recalibrate the financial system so that countries can break out of debt and pay for the cost of keeping people alive. So I don't like getting started on this vaccine hesitance. It's just a cover for the failures in the international system on delivering the supply that's needed and putting up the money that was needed to get the vaccines in people's arms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. And thank you everybody for your patience. I know we're just a minute over, but I see that Fatima's hand is up and Joe, and then George, I would like to give you the final word to wrap up this whole press conference. So Fatima, quickly, and then Joe will go to you and we'll let George wrap up.
Thanks. And, happy to speak to the journalists on email afterwards. I think there's just two things that enrages us, as Winnie says, about this very deliberate narrative or rules about a vaccine glut. The one is we don't have a treatment glut at the moment. Yet that conversation about including therapeutics in the waiver proposal, is being delayed for 3 months, 6 months, maybe even indefinitely. So I think there's a certain set of double standards. And we can give you the data if you interrogate when countries actually had sufficient supplies, or in my own country, which was doing better than most other countries in Africa. That only happened in November 2021, not 2020, not early 2021, in late 2021. And at the heart of this narrative, and I think people have to really be alive to this, is the idea that you don't pass a waiver on vaccines because you don't want to share what we call the gold, which is the mRNA vaccine platform. There's work that's being done in the mRNA hubs. There is a desire not to share that technology because of the potential of the WHO mRNA hubs, not just for COVID, but for HIV and TB. And so I think it links to what Joe said earlier about the Biden administration. The demands by our colleagues in the US and US groups have been around the Biden administration stepping in to share the mRNA technology, because that is where the benefit will be. Show me the glut of mRNA vaccines. I haven't seen them, right? So show me the glut of the third shot and the fourth shot. I think that's what we'd like to see before we can even engage additionally on this particular point. But the mRNA technology is so significant, and Joe is right, it belongs to the US government, and there's been some partial attempts to try and license a bit of that. But up until now, while these waiver negotiations are carrying on different versions of so-called text, neither Pfizer nor Moderna have decided to cooperate with the mRNA hub in South Africa. If you don't have a waiver that deals with these aspects around vaccines, then that technology is going to be withheld. It's going to continue being hoarded, even though it was significantly funded by the public in the US and elsewhere. And remember, we took part in the clinical trials. We may not have put the money on the table, but we are actually, being experimented on. Currently, Moderna has just launched a second trial in South Africa. So I just wanted to kind of put that in perspective around the importance of the vaccine waiver in relation to the mRNA technology going forward, particularly for booster programs in the global north as well as in the global south. Thanks.
Thank you, Fatima. Joe, we'll go to you quickly, and then George will wrap up with you. And thank you to all of you who have stayed on despite it being a little bit over. We appreciate it.
Three brief points. The first highlights what Fatima just said. We want to be prepared for the next pandemic. And being prepared for the next pandemic means having production facilities, capabilities, understanding the mRNA and other platforms. And so what is at issue here is developing capabilities, not only for this pandemic, but for the next. The second point is that we are going to be with the disease for a while. And I've reiterated over and over again the importance of testing and treatment, and a comprehensive clean waiver would deal with testing and treatment. No one has suggested that testing and treatment are problems that have been solved. There is a real supply problem in test and treatment. And finally, even with respect to the vaccines, there are new variants developed all the time, and they may be different in different parts of the world. There has to be the capacity to adapt quickly to the particular variants that are being manifested in particular parts of the world. So Africa and other regions of the world have to have their own capacity so that they can get a quick adaptation and a quick supply response. We don't want to have a 2-year response, which is what has happened in this case.
Thank you so much. So thank you to everybody for staying on a little bit over. George, you are the frontline worker on this panel, and you are at the moment advocating and an activist in Geneva from Liberia, clapping sarcastically for those billionaires who have made so much money from this pandemic. So we'd love to close this out with you, please. Thank you.
Thank you so kindly. And I want to thank Sarah for her
Oh,
question.
George, you're a little bit fuzzy to me. Can everybody hear George? Your microphone is a bit fuzzy.
Okay. Hello.
Perfect.
Okay. So I just wanted to thank Sarah for her question. And everybody has spoken to this issue of hesitancy so clearly. But I just wanted Sarah to get to know the statistics. They are there. If global south countries were able to use between 65 and 70% of the vaccines provided them, and still the population vaccinated is just like around 20%. And the global north used 60%, and they have gone so far. Where will you find the hesitancy, if there is any? So it is only a way of big farmers trying to dodge the issue of waiver. The facts are there. People are wanting the vaccine. They are not getting it. And when it comes to the soft, it comes almost expiring, which is another issue. And so we cannot dwell on these issues to say there's hesitancy. What happened to those who are willing to take the vaccine when they don't have it? In the global south, people have gone to their second tier booster, when in Africa, in some countries, just under 1% have been vaccinated. So this is where we are speaking from. And they hurry so much. When you are at the bedside, you are the end user for these medications and supplies on patients, and they are not there, and that puts you at risk. And because we as health workers, we are trained to save lives. The situation where you have to decide who dies is very traumatic. And we think this should not happen. It should stop now. Stop putting doctors and health workers at the level where they have to decide who will live and who will die. We think this is the reason everybody, including those who have lost relatives in this COVID pandemic, should stand up and call on our governments and those countries that are holding on to this strict waiver to realize that it is a necessary goal for the whole world. Because we're saying nobody should be left behind. And if nobody should be left behind, the way this is achievable is when we truly have a trade waiver that is going to produce vaccine and other medications and other supplies now and in the future in the time of another health crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. And having survived the Ebola epidemic and now working on this one, we know that you really speak from a place of experience. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who stayed on. I'm sorry that we're 10 minutes over, but I'm glad that most of you stayed on. Professor Stiglitz, Fatima Hassan, Winnie Byanyima, George Williams, we really, really appreciate you coming on to talk about this important topic. The recording will be made available to everybody, and you do have Joe Carpsoy's email address. If you have any follow-up questions, you'd like to reach any of the panelists, please reach out to Joe Carpsoy and he can direct you to the appropriate person. But thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate you coming on and listening and asking all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mazan.